Good evening, everyone. My name is Derrick Pratt, and I'm the Director of Education and Public Programming at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you very much for joining us today. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, and politically, but it was by no means operating in a vacuum. Thousands more miles of canals crisscrossed North America starting in the early 19th century. These canals have each been unique in their own ways, but also share a number of similarities, interacting with each other in a truly international network of transportation, trade, and communication. The aim of this series of talks, Canal Conversations, presented by the William G. Pomeroy Foundation, is to explore these various North American canals and discover more about our shared histories. Tonight, we are honored to host for this inaugural Canal Conversation Grant Vogl, Senior Manager of Collections and Exhibitions at Ottawa's Bytown Museum, and Adrian Petry, Visitor Services Coordinator at St. Catharines Museum and Welland Canals Center, who will be discussing the Rideau and Welland canals, respectively. But first, while I've got your attention, I'd like to highlight a few upcoming events here at the Erie Canal Museum. First off, tomorrow night, May 18th, marine archaeologist Art Cohen will be presenting both in person in Syracuse as well as on Zoom about his underwater study of sunken canal boats in Seneca Lake, including the discovery of a rare packet boat. Then on May 25th at noon, we will be hosting another hybrid lecture featuring artist-in-residence Matthew Lopez Jensen, who will be presenting on his ongoing art piece, The Work and the Water, which examines the New York State Canal Corporation's efforts to maintain our over 100-year-old barge canal system. If you're interested in either of those events, head over to our website, eriecanalmuseum.org, visit the shop page, and more information is available in the event tickets section. A few other quick plugs. On Saturday, May 20th at 10:30 a.m., we're hosting a volunteer tour guide training at the museum. No registration required, and all are welcome. And for those of you in the Niagara region, I know we have a few registered from there. On May 25th, we are working with Slow Roll Buffalo and the Buffalo Maritime Center to put on a beers, bikes, and barges guided cycling tour of the Buffalo River at 6 p.m. For information on that, visit Slow Roll Buffalo's website. So now on to the main event. Tonight, each of our speakers will present for about 10 minutes on their canal's history, with our speakers in order from when construction of their canal began. So it'll go from me, then Adrian, then Grant. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat, but also note that we won't be answering them until everyone has presented. After all our presentations have concluded, we'll discuss things we found interesting in our presentations amongst ourselves for about another 10 minutes. Then we'll start getting to audience questions. So with all that said, we'll get started here, and we will look at the New York State Canal System. All right. My PowerPoint works. All right. So to understand New York's canals, you've got to understand what New York was like prior to the canals being built. This is the ancestral homeland, most of the canal corridor of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora nations lived here for centuries and continue to live along the banks of the Erie Canal today. And the first peoples to live in upstate New York began settling along the Great Glacial Lake. As the glaciers receded, a large lake, its footprints are kind of Lake Ontario, Oneida Lake, and parts of the Finger Lakes existed. Nowadays, the Great Lakes drain through the St. Lawrence River, but those were still blocked by ice, so we need to find a new way to get to the ocean. And what ended up happening was that lake eroded away a channel right here. This is the Mohawk River Valley, which separates the Catskill Mountains to the south from the Appalachian or the Adirondack Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains stretch all the way from Georgia all the way up into Canada. And then they flow down, so the Mohawk River would then flow down the Hudson River into the Atlantic Ocean. So this presented an incredibly unique bit of geography for the East Coast of the United States. It's the only place between Georgia and Maine under 600 feet in elevation, offering an ideal location for a canal. All right, and in 1817, I'm really yada-yadaing my way from that to 1817, but I got 10 minutes. They start constructing the Erie Canal, July 4th, 1817, here in Rome, right in the middle. And this waterway, almost entirely a completely artificial waterway, 363 miles long, links Lake Erie at Buffalo to Albany on the Hudson River, thus linking the upper Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. And that is they overcome 571 feet in elevation change, and that is initially accomplished through 83 locks. And it comes at a cost. So that's another important thing to note. New York's canal system is completely funded by the New York State government and is still owned and operated by New York. They have tried to get federal funding, doesn't work. Similarly, they had tried another private corporation earlier that also was not fully successful. Anyway, let's look at the building of the canal. These are several of the engineers who construct the canal. Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, they are two of the chief engineers, and they also find a talented local bunch of engineers, notably Candace White, Nathan Roberts, and John B. Jervis. None of these men have technical training in engineering. Several had been involved in surveying, others, but really they studied books by Europeans. Candace White goes to England for a year and studies canals over there. But they still create this engineering marvel, and it is recognized today by the American Society of Civil Engineering as the birthplace of American civil engineering. And they accomplished a number of feats. Granted, these are all on a later version of the canal. This is pre-photography, so we don't have a lot of pictures. They cross rivers utilizing aqueducts and other natural streams. And then you have impressive locks. And I really want to highlight this one here. These are the Lockport Flight of Five, often considered one of the greatest engineering feats of the canal. These overcome the Niagara Escarpment at Lockport. I think that'll come up later. A flight of 5 locks. They raise over 60 feet. Though also impressive is if they went all the way to the top of the Niagara Escarpment, they'd be higher than the level of Lake Erie, and they needed to get water in this thing. So they also construct the Deep Cut, several mile long man-made canyon that canal boats pass through. As you can see from this picture, it is mostly hand dug. Out in Lockport, they start using rudimentary blasting powder from DuPont, but yeah. And initially, a lot of the work is done by Anglo-European settlers and farmers, but as the work became increasingly difficult, they increasingly saw more and more immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, especially around here in Lockport. So here is kind of the greatest extent of the New York State Canal System. New York, as well as the rest of America, after the Erie Canal opens, is gripped by what's called canal mania, and we get a number of side canals off of the Erie, including a number that hook up to kind of the Canadian borderlands. You've got the Oswego Canal, which becomes incredibly important in cross Lake Ontario trade. You've also got the Black River Canal going up to the Black River, and then the Champlain Canal over here. I don't know if my face is in the way for everyone else, but it's over there connecting Lake Champlain. And I believe there's another, I'm no Canadian canals expert, but I believe there's another one at the northern end of Lake Champlain as well. So anyway, That's the New York State Canal System. Along the canal's banks, another nickname of the canal is the Mother of Cities. A number of cities spring up along its banks, including the Erie Canal Museum's hometown of Syracuse, as well as Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Lockport, Schenectady, Albany. I could go on. They all boom economically for a number of reasons. Syracuse is famous for its salt. Here we see a map of Syracuse. It goes from 1820, 250 people live in it. This is the 1870s. There's about 70,000 people. Here are the extensive Syracuse salt fields. You can see the city radiates out from the Erie Canal. That's the canal. That's the Oswego Canal. I want to just quickly zoom in to the intersection of those two canals. So how did New York State pay for this thing? Well, we had a very unique sort of toll system, which was the waylock. So you bring your boat into this giant scale mechanism housed within this building. Your boat would have been weighed empty prior to the canal season beginning. The canal would close, by the way, between November about and April or May. Canal opens May 19th this year. Anyway, then they could figure out the weight of your canal cargo and you'd get charged a toll. This building is the only remaining of these 7 waylocks and is also consequently where I work, the Erie Canal Museum. So stop on down. And they continued to collect tolls until 1883, when the railroads start to outcompete the canals. There's a big kind of debate over whether or not to close down the New York State canals or to expand them. And ultimately, they choose to expand them. In 1903, a new enlarged barge canal is authorized. Begins digging in 1905, and they will do that until 1918, when the New York State Barge Canal System, which utilizes, as you can see, tugboats or self-propelled barges, opens up, and that is able to remain competitive with railroads and other forms of transportation into the 1950s, when the St. Lawrence Seaway opens up in 1959, and it kind of siphons away a lot of that existing canal traffic to go up north to Canada. So I got a bone to pick with you guys later here. But anyway, here is the modern canal system as it stands. You can see there's the main branch of the Erie. There's also the Oswego, Cayuga Seneca, and Champlain canals. So definitely went over my 10 minutes. Sorry about that, guys. Oh, and we're now currently celebrating, commemorating the 200th anniversary of the canal system with a Reimagine the Canals initiative to make the canals relevant for the next 200 years. There's a lot of recreational boating and cycling that occurs on its banks. So now I've definitely gone over 10 minutes. And we will transition to Adrian and the Welland.
Hopefully I'll keep it shorter, and then Grant will even us out. Without the Welland Canal, the Dominion would be little better than a home for cats and badgers. One of my favorite quotes. We're putting it on a t-shirt this year. The St. Catharines Daily Times, 1871. Next slide, please. There's little doubt among historians of the Welland's incredible impact to the culture and economy of Niagara and Canada. The opening of the Great Lakes to shipping traffic was a game changer for the interior of North America. As a solution for navigation around Niagara Falls and the Niagara Escarpment, the canal created a stable and a much more reliable and quick transportation route, just to talk a little bit about competition with the Erie, and made available an unending water supply and water power for mills that would operate along its banks for 150 years. Today, with only 10 minutes or so, I'd like to relay some of the more interesting tales from the canal's history and the vital link that keeps the basic foundations of our economy flowing. Next slide, please. After years of surveying, a group of businessmen led by settler William Hamilton Merritt formed the Welland Canal Company with the intention of building a canal between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie using existing waterways. Next slide, please. With water levels drastically low during the milling seasons, a canal would supply much needed water power to mills in Niagara. It would also help with moving goods and supplies into the upper Great Lakes, which were currently transported around Niagara Falls over a land portage or after 1825 through the Erie Canal, as you heard. Next slide, please. The Welland Canal Company broke ground in 1824 and over the next 5 years built a series of 40 wooden, manually operated locks between Port Dalhousie here in St. Catharines and dug a feeder canal between Port Dalhousie and the Niagara River, where Chippewa Creek or the Welland River meets the Niagara River just above Niagara Falls. And then they dug a feeder canal to bring water from the Grand River, almost 40 kilometers to the west, and eventually completed the southern section of the canal to Lake Erie at Port Colborne in 1833. Next slide. The first canal was approximately 44 kilometers long with 40 locks made of wood. The locks were 33.5 meters by 6.7 meters, or 110 feet by 22 feet for my American friends, with the minimum depth of 2.4 meters, or approximately 8 feet. The story of the construction of the first Welland Canal always captures my admiration because it was a hot mess from the time the canal began. Even fundraising was a hot mess, and it really should have never been completed. Its success was a stroke of luck and genius political and financial maneuvering by William Hamilton Merritt and the Canal Company directors. It cost well over £500,000 to complete, which is approximately $31 million today, Canadian. Nearly 5 times the original estimates, and its constant need for repairs meant it never competed to its full potential against the Erie Canal. The wooden locks of the first canal needed to be replaced with only a few years, and so the Welland Canal Company undertook efforts to build a second, more modern waterway in situ. So most of the first canal locks are gone or buried. By 1839, the government of the United Province of Canada was essentially the controlling partner of the company, with nearly the majority shares and with most seats on the board, which were held by elected members of the legislature. The pressure to buy out the remaining foreign ownership, which was mostly American ownership, increased, and as well as the public demand for government control over a now mostly government-funded project. Next slide, please. So in 1841, the government of the United Province of Canada bought out the shareholders, reorganized the company board of directors into a board of works, and by 1841, as I mentioned, began deepening and widening the canal, along with building new stone locks. The second canal was open to shipping in 1845 with 27 stone-cut locks made from locally cut limestone, replacing the 40 wooden locks of the first canal. Each lock was about 45 meters or 150 feet by 8 meters or 26.5 feet-ish. It was a huge undertaking and required thousands of skilled and unskilled workers. Most were Irish, Scottish, German, and some American immigrants who had worked on other canal projects across North America, including the Erie and the Rideau canals. Some families remained in Niagara, becoming a part of our community. The Panic of 1837 and the following depression, which I wish we had more time to talk about because it's super cool, caused the immediate unemployment of thousands of poor, unskilled Irish laborers who had flocked to the private canal projects in Ohio and Pennsylvania. After their cancellation or their delay, the resulting influx of Irish laborers at this time completely changed the canal building project in Niagara. All of a sudden, the only canal project in operation in almost most of northern North America, in this part of the world anyway, was the Welland. And so all of a sudden, and almost overnight, almost 5,000 Irish laborers and their families arrived on the canal works, demanding work and provisions. The population of St. Catharines at that time was approximately 3,500 people, so we're well outnumbered. Without any social support network at the time, it fell to local organizations, especially the Catholic Church, to organize food and relief so that the huge numbers of Irish would stop raiding local farms, mills, shops, and ships, stealing food and supplies. The Canal Company or the Board of Works set up a small police force, which wasn't very effective. It was only 20 people against 5,000 Irishmen. And the governor of the province stationed at least 2 small companies of the Royal Canadian Rifles in St. Catharines and a company of 200 of the Colored Corps militia, a unit of Black soldiers in Port Robinson, to deal with job, food, or strike-related riots. The impact of their arrival of this group is still felt today, as again, some in the community can trace their roots to the arrival of their ancestors who worked on this canal. The canal remained hand-operated, but expanded canal ponds helped fuel rapid expansion of industrial activity and towns along the waterway. You'll see a theme here, especially with Derrick's canal as well. I'm sure with Grant's canal. I say it like it's our canals of canal leading industrial activity. So next slide. Many of St. Catharines' surviving industrial buildings from the period, which are our best built heritage in the city. The city was ravaged by 1970s brutalist architecture, unfortunately. So the few remaining factory buildings that we have are the famous Beaver Cotton Mills, or the Independent Rubber Company. The building on the left here burned down in the 60s, but the building on the right with the big smokestack is now the Keg restaurant. Next slide. That was built in 1885. The Lipster Cotton Mill, which became Domtar Paper for a while, is now, that stone building in the center is now Johnny Rocco's restaurant. The Maple Leaf Rubber Company factory building, next slide, in Port Dalhousie is soon to be condos, we hope. And then the next slide, Canada Haircloth Company building, built along this is downtown St. Catharines, built along the old canal, is now the home of the Brock University's arts department, drama, music, visual arts. And that factory building was built in 1888 and one of the first in Ontario to have electricity generated from the canal. That's another story. I wish we had more time. Next slide, please. Steamship technology and the increasing size of ships and the development of international shipping pressured the government of Canada to build a third, more direct route for the canal. It was an exciting time, and this was really the first major infrastructure project for the new federal government. The new project held a significant impact of change for the people in Niagara. In contrast to the early local business interests that had built the first canal, the government set its sight on the national economy, and the government restricted milling, industry, and local traffic on the waterway in favor of international shipping on the Great Lakes. The canal was to feature as a central part of Prime Minister Macdonald's national policy to get the economy going and unite the former colonies economically. Next slide. It was a sore point for Niagara industry, business, and businessmen who were going to be kept away from the new canal and all of that wonderful new industry opportunity. It was debated in the House of Commons as well. In 1881, St. Catharines MP John Charles Reichert asked the House of Commons why no provision had been made for a turning basin and industry on the new canal. And Charles Tupper, the Minister of Railways and Canals, explained, quote, "The principal business on this canal must be made through trade. Therefore, there will be no mills or factories or other places where vessels will at all be likely to unload or receive cargo on the new line." It was new line, end quote. It was to be a port-to-port operation, and unfortunately, the peripheral benefits would no longer be available for local inhabitants looking for success along the route. Next slide, please. Construction of the larger 26 stone-cut locks of the third canal were completed started in 1871, completed in 1881, except for the aqueduct that carries the canal over the Welland River in Welland, which wasn't completed until 1887. And that's a picture of this, that construction site. You can actually, the top right there's a brick sort of stone wall. That's the aqueduct of the second canal. And this disaster zone of a construction site was just as a disaster for the third canal. But that's another story. And I actually have a great lecture on that on our YouTube page, all about the third canal. So you can check this out. Next slide. So the new canal cut across farmland and was a shorter, more direct route, bypassing downtown St. Catharines. The locks were an impressive sight at the time and were nearly double the length of the previous second canal. But because of, as you can see, because of the lack of industrial presence along the canal, it is mostly forgotten and mostly buried today. In contrast with the second canal, which served industries until at least the 1920s, even though navigation ended in the 1880s, and which still carries water through the city today. Once again, the demands of international shipping and the increasing size of ships on the Great Lakes demanded a new route. So next slide, the new Welland Ship Canal began construction in 1913 under the direction of engineer J.L. Weller and then later Alexander Grant. You can see here the line that goes up to the left, sort of across the big lock, is the old third canal. And then the line that carries through sort of the center with the big lock is the new Welland Ship Canal. You can see the flight locks in the distance. So the new route ran along 10 Mile Creek, which was a little creek that was blown big, beginning at Port Weller and traveling up the Niagara Escarpment to Port Colborne. The flight locks there carry the canal up the escarpment. So next slide. The Welland Ship Canal was a major engineering achievement of the 20th century with only 8 concrete locks, each holding approximately 92 million liters of water or 24.3 million gallons of water. Locks were now each 233 meters long or 766 feet long by 24 meters wide or 80 feet wide. So huge, 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 huge. Next slide, please. Yep. Construction of the canal was arduous and completed in 1932 at a cost of $135 million, approximately $100 million over budget. The works were not in operation from 1916 to 1919 due to labor shortages and the difficulty of getting supplies, including concrete, during the First World War. Laborers from all over the world worked on the new Welland Ship Canal in comparison to the 5,000 Irish. People from all over the world flocked to work on the canal. Unfortunately, 138 men lost their lives in construction accidents on this canal. We don't have numbers for the earlier canals. Many were immigrants who did not speak English and were unprepared for the worksite that they encountered with steam, electric, powered tools alongside construction railways. The worksite was fraught with hazards unacceptable by today's health and safety standards. So next slide. Today, the Welland Canal significantly impact urban development throughout Niagara as they cut across the region, and their legacy lasts through road and rail networks originally planned to support or avoid the canals. So in this slide, St. Catharines is on the right. You can see Lake Ontario. It's a weird map. I didn't design it, but St. Catharines is on the right. And the green line you can see is the third canal that cuts away from downtown. And the squiggly orange line is the second canal route. So that's where downtown St. Catharines is. While most people are annoyed with waiting for the lift bridges, the canal represents approximately $45 billion of economic activity and over 200,000 jobs in both the US and Canada, with over 3,000 transits per season. Yeah, you can go to the next slide if you like. Over 3,000 transits per season, the Welland Canal and the St. Lawrence Seaway represent the most efficient and now greenest way to move bulk cargo. For example, one of the big ships replaces approximately 900 transport trucks. So 900 times 3,000 transits is how many roads are off, or how many trucks are off the roads here in the GTA, thank goodness. Today's Welland Canal is a testament to its past and an important part of our economic future. Thanks so much. Off to Grant.
All right, thank you, Adrian. I already noticed we got a comment saying we need to do this again, but with not 10 minutes. I dare say, don't worry, we're all going to go over time.
Except if you gave me more than 10 minutes, I'll take 90 minutes.
Right.
So
Yeah.
10 minutes is good. Believe me.
So be sure to check out everybody else's, all of our museums have YouTube pages, I believe, where you can learn a whole bunch more from all of us. Anyway, I'll send it over to you, Grant, and tell us about the Rideau Canal.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks to Derrick for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in tonight's talk. Like you said, my name is Grant Vogl. I'm the Senior Manager of Collections and Exhibitions at the Bytown Museum in Ottawa, where I've worked for about 13 years now. Tonight, I'm going to be speaking specifically about the early history, development, and construction of the Rideau between 1826 and 1832, as well as some of the legacy for Bytown and what would become the nation's capital of Ottawa. Slide, please. So I'd like to start by stating that the Bytown Museum and the City of Ottawa are located on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose people have lived on this territory for millennia and whose culture and presence continue to nurture this place. Next slide, please. By way of a brief historical background, the Bytown Museum can trace its roots back to the founding of the Women's Canadian Historical Society in 1898. These intrepid women wrote historical pamphlets, delivered lectures, and curated lone exhibitions, like the one seen here, to highlight the early history of Bytown and Ottawa. Next slide, please. By 1917, the WCHSO was in need of a permanent home. After years of wandering, the former City Registry building was acquired and named the Bytown Historical Museum, which opened on October 25th, 1917, as a, quote, museum for relics and souvenirs. Next slide, please. After years of collecting and with a boom in the 1930s, the WCHSO once again was looking for a larger home. In 1948, the commissariat at the Ottawa Locks was proposed. The building was described as encrusted with century-old dust and grime, with deteriorated plaster, a leaking roof, and inadequate electrical system. However, the building committee still said it was the perfect setting for the Bytown Museum, which opened its doors in 1952 in the commissariat, and that's where we are today. With that, I'd like to move on to the Rideau Canal and its construction, use, and legacy. Yeah, thanks, Derrick. So the Rideau Canal was planned in response to the War of 1812. Irrespective of any treaties, Great Britain remained wary of the territorial desires of the United States. The British recognized that the Americans could potentially disrupt vital supply route between Montreal, Kingston, and the Great Lakes by blockading the St. Lawrence River, cutting off key military installations and infrastructure. An alternate supply route was needed, its strongest advocate being a hero of the Napoleonic War, the Duke of Wellington. Its construction would be under the superintendence of a semi-retired royal engineer named John By. Next slide, please. Born in Lambeth, England in 1779, John By began his military career as a second lieutenant in the Royal Artillery. He soon thereafter transferred to the Royal Engineers and steadily rose through the ranks, seeing action during the Napoleonic Wars and eventually obtaining the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1824. 2 years later, he was ordered out of semi-retirement and to the Canadas to supervise the construction of the planned Rideau Canal. Next slide, please. Surveying of potential routes for the proposed canal began as early as 1814. Planners determined that the most practical route was a link to the Ottawa River and Lake Ontario at Kingston, following the Rideau and Cataraqui river systems. In 1823, Samuel Close, a civil engineer, set out from Kingston to make a preliminary survey of the various proposed routes of the canal, completing his work in the spring of 1824. Close provided the first detailed survey of the route, as well as an unrealistically low cost estimate for the project, something that would haunt Colonel By in years to come. Slide, please. On May 30th, 1826, Colonel By, accompanied by his wife Esther and their 2 daughters, landed at Quebec and immediately reported to Colonel Durnford, the commanding Royal Engineer in Canada. This was By's second time arriving to post in Canada, the first being as a 23-year-old lieutenant serving at the Citadel in Quebec. By was later described as an officer of singular activity of mind and body. Slide, please. Arriving in the Ottawa Valley in September, Colonel By met and conferred with Philemon Wright, the knowledgeable and well-connected founder of the thriving settlement across the river then known as Wrightstown, which is today's Hull. Shortly thereafter, and taking Wright's shrewd advice, By decided on Slay Bay, later known as Entrance Bay, instead of Samuel Close's original site near the Breton Flats, as the location of the headlocks of the Rideau Canal. On September 29, 1826, Lord Dalhousie, seen here, arrived to ceremonially turn the first sod at the site of the Ottawa Locks. What followed was a lavish and riotous party at the Tavern of Philemon Wright. Next slide, please. Planning progressed, with By himself drafting many early plans for the locks and dams. He wrote to Colonel Durnford in November of 1826, stating with confidence that he would send sketches and plans for the first 7 miles of the canal rising 100 feet above the Ottawa River, and may be considered the greatest portion of the whole work done by January. Next slide, please. By December of 1826, advertisements for tender were appearing in Canadian and American newspapers. One such read, "The works on the Rideau Canal seem to divide themselves into the following great branches: building and finishing locks of heavy masonry, excavating earth and clay, excavating rock and gravel, constructing aqueducts and bridges of wood, etc." Each contractor had to cite 2 guarantors who were, quote, "Canadian residents of responsible character," and could only engage in their own line of work. Although the vast majority of the construction was undertaken by civilian contractors and their workers, all of the engineering and design was the work of the Royal Engineers. Slide, please. On May 3rd, 1827, Lieutenant Colonel By and, quote, 6 large canoes filled with persons wishing to become contractors plied the waters of the Rideau and Cataraqui rivers along the proposed line of the new canal. Over the course of 3 days, the party consumed 40 gallons of rum. Historian Edward Bush later stated, and rightfully so, that the diet may have been monotonous, but surely the evenings were not. Slide, please. By June 30th of 1827, workers had excavated nearly 21,000 cubic feet of clay from Entrance Bay for the building of the Ottawa locks and transported it by wheelbarrow to the breastwork dam below. The dam was used to stop the water of the Ottawa River from breaking through the natural banks of the lock pits. A man named John Pennyfeather, a native of Tipperary, Ireland, had been awarded the excavation contract for Entrance Bay and would have employed scores of his fellow countrymen to dig the lock pits, haul and break rock, and build the embankments. Next slide, please. On August 16th, 1827, Sir John Franklin, having recently returned from an expedition on the Mackenzie River, laid what was called the first stone on the Rideau Canal with full Masonic honors. Research indicated that it was actually laid in the trough of the inverted arch at the 3rd lock up from the Ottawa River, which was at the time the most nearing completion. On the occasion, a cask of rum was tapped with rations distributed among the laborers to encourage their continuing efforts. You can see a theme with rum. Next slide, please. Writing to General Mann in November of 1827, By stated, quote, "I feel convinced that on the 12th of August, 1830, I shall have completed this magnificent water communication way from the Ottawa to Kingston. But to enable me to do this, I shall require £100,000 each year for positive disbursements on the spot, and have marked on the plan where the 4 companies of Royal Sappers and Miners could be employed to great advantage, should I be favored with the assistance of 2 more companies." Next slide, please. So in early 1827, at the request of By, 2 companies of sappers and miners were sent to the Rideau Canal Works. These soldier artificers were skilled tradesmen, so masons, miners, carpenters, smiths, coopers, and quarrymen, who also served in a military capacity to guard stores, maintain order, and act as foremen and overseers. The 7th and 15th companies, totaling 160 men, were under the command of officers from the Royal Engineers. A high percentage of the men hailed from the West Country of England due to their skill in dry key work, dam construction, masonry, and mining. Colonel By was actually said to have preferred men from Cornwall for their long-standing mining traditions. Next slide, please. Sappers were paid an extra wage according to their trade. They constructed some of the first stone structures in Bytown, including military barracks and a hospital on Berwick Hill, which is today's Parliament Hill, the first bridge, Sappers Bridge, over the canal. Carpenters built heavy oak lock gates. Smiths, under Master Blacksmith William Tormey, built the geared crabs to operate them, and a detachment of men undertook the completion of the dam at Hogsback after contractors failed to accomplish adequate results. When construction of the canal was complete, each soldier who had provided satisfactory service was offered a 100-acre land grant if they wished to remain in the Ottawa Valley, and 71 men did so. And many of these men became the first permanent staff to operate the locks on the Rideau Canal. Next slide, please. The Rideau Canal was largely built by hand, with shovels, wheelbarrows, pickaxes, and pulleys. The annual workforce on the canal, drawn from both an existing labor market and new immigrants, varied between 2,000 and 6,000 men per season, and was in many cases dependent on seasonal conditions. Workers were overwhelmingly Irish and French Canadian, but also included English, Scottish, and ironically, even a few Americans, whom the canal was intended to guard against. Indigenous peoples whose trade routes and traditional hunting grounds were disrupted by the massive project continued to trap and trade along the corridor which cut through their traditional territory. Slide, please. Unskilled laborers, or navvies, a term used to describe workers on inland navigation systems, worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week, fighting heat and disease in the summer and biting cold in the winter. Swamp fever or malaria was the biggest killer, with many more workers being killed or injured in blasting and other work-related accidents. Workers were, quote, constantly dependent on the company credit and continually in debt. All were hired on month-to-month basis and pay was often based on piecework, so a fixed wage per stone cut, land cleared, or tree felled. Next slide, please. In addition to his military activities on the canal, Colonel By reluctantly handled the settlement's early development. He and his engineers surveyed the land surrounding the canal works, rented lots to settlers, laid out new streets, and adopted regulations for the building of houses. Presiding over what would become Bytown was no easy feat. Public drunkenness and violence were part of daily life, leading By to attempt in vain to shut down both licensed and illegal brewing and distilling near the canal works. In February of 1830, an old world quarrel between the Orange and the Green at Hogsback literally exploded into violence. Fighting among canal workers and a man named Mr. Lytle resulted in his windows being smashed. Several men, hell-bent on further retribution, broke into the stores of Creighton and Mackay and stole a cask of black powder. The cask was placed at Lytle's home, fired, and the building was, quote, blown to atoms, along with one of the assailants, a man named Riley, who was killed in the blast. This incident induced Colonel By to increase military presence at the Hogback works. Next slide, please. As early as December of 1826, By had begun arguing for an increase to the lock dimensions from 108 by 20 feet to 150 by 50 feet in order to accommodate new naval steamboats. He wrote to Colonel Durnford, commanding officer of the Royal Engineers, in April of 1828, quote, "It's a strange thing to have no orders about the larger lock. Would you advise me to proceed with the small ones? For the contractors are getting outrageous with delay." Eventually, a compromise of 134 by 33 feet would be reached, but not until June of 1828, when the first 3 locks, already built to the earlier dimensions and incorporating John Franklin's cornerstone, were demolished and rebuilt. Costs had steadily increased over the course of the project, with By's initial estimate of £576,757, not including the cost of any military or defensive works. Next slide, please. Throughout the construction process, various sections of the canal were open for navigation upon their completion. As early as September of 1830, the first 80 kilometers south from the Ottawa locks were open for steamship navigation. On September 25th, 1830, the celebratory first passage of the lock at Black Rapids was undertaken. The party, including the contracting team of Phillips and White, passed through the lock in a canoe and then proceeded to Phillips' home to celebrate their achievement for the first lock through on the Rideau Canal. Next slide, please. Finally, on May 29, 1832, Colonel By, his family, major contractors, and fellow officers of the Royal Engineers arrived in Bytown from Kingston aboard the rechristened steamship Rideau, formerly Robert Drummond's pumper, ending their inaugural journey along the entire length of the newly completed Rideau Canal. By gifted his main contracting teams with silver trophy cups and autographed silhouettes to mark the momentous occasion. Slide, please. However, his achievements were soon overshadowed by his recall to England to answer for overspending. Despite latent support from his fellow officers, By was publicly reprimanded, his reputation all but ruined. He was caught in the middle of a political battle, the blame for the massive cost overrun laid at his feet and his alone. Demoralized, By retired to his residence at Schernfold Park, where he passed away on February 1st, 1836. Thanks in large part to the efforts of the Women's Canadian Historical Society of Ottawa, Colonel By is now rightly remembered as the founding father of Bytown and Ottawa and the mastermind behind our Rideau Canal System. Next slide, please. So the Rideau Canal was not completed until May of 1832, at a final cost of £822,804. So roughly $42 million Canadian today. Although a Parks Canada estimate from 2012 placed a value at roughly $1 billion on all of the associated structures, canal, etc. It was never used for its intended purpose, though, as a military supply route. However, it did become a near immediate commercial success, a lifeline for the Port of Montreal for raw goods, supplies, materials, and timber, as well as for thousands of immigrants destined for Upper Canada. Next slide, please. January 5th, 1850, Bytown was incorporated as a town, with civic government replacing the military authority established during the Rideau Canal period. The name of Bytown persisted until January 1st of 1855, when the town, with, quote, rather dubious reputation, referred to as the most violent settlement in all of British North America, was rebranded as the City of Ottawa, and By's role in its founding was somewhat forgotten. Next slide, please. There's currently no reliable numbers about the true cost of building the canal. Reasonable estimates place the number killed at well over 1,000. However, the horrors of the Rideau Canal construction have been, down to the present, largely ascribed to those Irish laborers lost to disease and blasting accidents, while the impact of the colonial administration project on the Indigenous population have largely been ignored in contemporary commemorations. Next slide, please. The Rideau Canal was the largest engineering project of its time. It's a testament to the ingenuity and the perseverance of Lieutenant Colonel By and his labor force that the 202-kilometer-long canal, complete with 47 masonry locks and 74 dams, was completed in less than 6 seasons. Slide, please. A Canadian National Heritage Site since 1925 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2007, today's picturesque Rideau Canal, although it certainly wasn't always so, operates much in the same way that it did when it first opened in 1832. It's one of the best preserved examples of a 19th century slackwater canal system. Last slide, please. So thanks very much for your time and for the invitation to speak tonight. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thanks, Derrick.
Thank you, Grant. Appreciate it. Just again, in case people have a question or anything, I've got this little graphic here. We all embodied as a form of locks, plate of locks, excuse me. But thanks everyone. That was really interesting and enlightening to learn about each of your canals. I think we can stop screen sharing. We can just chat here. People can start asking questions in the chat now, though if we want, we can chat a little about what we found interesting.
I mean, one thing that jumped out at me, Derrick, when you were speaking about how the Erie is about 363 miles and almost exclusively man-made. So the Rideau Canal runs 202 kilometers and only about 19 kilometers are man-made. The rest is flooded lakes, flooded river systems, or natural systems. So quite a contrast there in terms of both undertaking and scale.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well. Also, for our Canadian friends, that's 584 kilometers. I had calculated it all out. It made me jealous, Adrian, when you started converting things into feet. I forgot the metric system exists.
Yes, we have a lot of American visitors, so we try our best to keep both going at the same time. It's really difficult.
Yeah. So what is the Welland? Mostly slackwater or man-made?
It's mostly man-made. It's tricky because it's like which canal you're talking about. It uses different systems for each one. The Erie wasn't those. So the Erie today is the main water source. But it only became the water source in the third canal era in the 1880s. Before that, the Grand River was piped in essentially on the feeder canal to the second and the first canal. So controlling water in the area was really tricky. There's lots of underwater springs that they were digging too deep, then they were not digging deep enough, and then Merritt looked to the folks, the contractors on the Erie Canal, especially a guy called Oliver Phelps, who moved from construction on the Erie Canal. He's one of the contractors out there, to come to work on our deep cut. And our deep cut sort of takes the height of the escarpment to the level of Lake Erie almost, but there's a height of land above the escarpment that we had to get through with no water source up there. So we had to cut through, and we relied on American contractors to do most of that work. So yeah, the name copying comes from that most of the contractors and laborers worked on other canals and then came out to the Welland.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And
I've read a lot of reports of workers just kind of making the rounds between the canal phrase. Not only the workers, but we have a kind of a mythical, semi-mythical figure here, Mother McGinty, who was had a tavern set up at the Rideau Canal, and she was known to move around to these canal works to kind of slake the thirst of the typical canal worker drinking, a gallon of whiskey a week. So they were definitely moving around between the systems. But I found interesting too, because I think like looking at the Rideau Canal, which was built specifically as a military canal, versus the other two, which were specifically industrial from the beginning. And then with like the threat subsiding and the canal being then turned as like a transportation route, the Rideau Canal really remained static. It's almost like trapped in time, and that's I think why it's like such a excellent example of a 19th century slackwater canal. Whereas looking at both of your systems, like third, fourth iterations to kind of bring it up to present day, is really an interesting contrast.
Yeah, I found that really interesting about the Rideau Canal as well, that you got built once. And
yeah, I mean, there's been ongoing, updates and masonry's been redone and lock gates are replaced, but by and large, it's roughly kind of as it was.
I know Ottawa and Kingston, the two termini of your canal, are major cities. But are there any other major settlements like towns that grew up along the Rideau?
The landscape.
I mean,
yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. I grew up there, so I grew up in Russell, Grant. So
yeah,
I'll try not to answer.
We've got a lot of like settlements and towns along the routes and stuff like that, but it's not certainly like the Erie where you've got these major urban centers. We've got like Manotick and stuff like that, but in Merrickville and along the way. But really, Ottawa, Kingston are like the two biggest population centers along the canal system.
Cool. And Adrian, I was noticing looked like a bunch of towns sprung up along. Well,
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah,
even
absolutely.
though it's relatively short for one of our other two canals.
Yeah, I mean, St. Catharines is only one example along the entire route of the exact same type of development that the canal fostered and engendered throughout its history. So Welland is the next biggest one, but Thorold, Port Colborne, even the smaller communities inside of those bigger, now much bigger cities, where sort of people gathered to work in the factories and that kind of thing. Huge impact to support community.
Yeah. Before we,
I had a question for Derrick actually. What was the pay system called? The laylock system?
Oh, the waylock.
Oh, waylock. Yeah. So I hadn't seen that before, and to this day the Rideau is per foot essentially of boat going through. So that's really interesting just from my perspective of seeing that photo and like they're tearing the weight of the boat and then reweighing it and stuff. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a fairly rare, from what we can tell, system of toll. There's 2 or 3 other canal systems in America that used it, which, who knows? Stay tuned for future canal conversations. We might have a few of them on. Briefly, I want to touch on, just before we get to audience questions, I was thinking throughout this, like how has American and Canadian relations, would you say, impacted your canal? I mean, granted, it's pretty obvious, Erie Canal exists because
Certainly it exists for that reason, but I would say the vast majority of boaters going through today are American.
interesting.
So yeah, and I always love reading reports of Americans. There's American workers, but even some reports of American soldiers going AWOL and then finding employment building the Rideau Canal, which I just love as a Canadian.
That's awesome. Mine's pretty obvious. Today is run by the St. Lawrence Seaway Corporation, which is a binational corporation. So we're in the Canadian section, but there's American sections throughout. And so, yeah, it's a huge partnership. But originally built, I mean, for the local milling, but in terms of paying for it, they were hoping it would be a really good competitor to the Erie because the route is so much shorter and so much easier and more better. And I'm just kidding. And the just more simplified, I guess. And it worked after the second canal was built. We certainly took over that way. And then the third canal, by the time the third canal was built, it was already too busy. Like third canal completed and they started thinking about the fourth canal because it was so busy and so popular. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the origins of the Erie Canal as well kind of go back to the U.S., well, Canadian, I guess, relation. I mean, that's partially why it goes to Lake Erie instead of Lake Ontario, because they were worried all the trade was going to go to Montreal rather than New York City, et cetera. Also, the War of 1812, we saw like transportation in upstate New York was just a mess. I'm also seeing that the Ohio and Erie and Miami and Erie canals had waylocks from our next presenter on Canal Conversations in October, excuse me. So check that out. Also, I would highly recommend to everyone watching, if you're interested in that question we just answered, Overcoming Niagara is a great book about the interesting borderlands that exist with all these canals. So let's quickly hop over to user questions, or not user, viewer questions. And if you have... there's a lot of questions.
If you have any more, please type.
That's great. Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, so we've got one. The Erie and they assume the Rideau are mostly for recreational boating. Is that allowed on the Welland? And,
yes, it is. Woo! Though commercial traffic has priority, so recreational boats travel in a flotilla. Going upbound from here in St. Catharines to Port Weller, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, I think, and then downbound from Port Colborne on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Our tolls are per transit too, so we're boring. It's just a number.
Oh, okay.
There's no calculation.
Fair enough. Let's see. Lot of comments here. Let's see. We got one on how much was the fourth Welland modified to meet the standards of the Seaway, which could be an interesting question.
Yeah, it's interesting. The canal was built before the Seaway opened, so it's really the Seaway was designed around the existing canal, like that would link it. The Seaway was designed to link a bunch of the canals around the Great Lakes. So there have been modifications to make it easier for international ships to come in, but the Rideau has not changed since it was the Welland hasn't changed in terms of size really. Some operational things have changed, but the locks haven't changed since it opened in 1932.
Okay.
They did talk about building a fifth canal, I should mention, with 3 or 4 or 5 super locks that would be enormous and be able to carry lots of stuff, but nobody has billions and billions and billions of dollars. That idea was in the 60s and they abandoned that plan. So
interesting. Grant, do you see much impact from the St. Lawrence Seaway on the Rideau at all?
I mean, no, it's exclusively like a pleasure way at this point. We get a lot of beautiful ships coming through, boats coming through. In the summertime, we've got so many people on site. Like the Ottawa locks are right in the heart of downtown Ottawa, right beside Chateau Laurier Hotel and Parliament buildings. So a lot of foot traffic, usually at least 1 million people walking by every season. So it's definitely like a tourist destination. No barges, no big ships. Yeah. A lot of bad music. I'll say that. People going through need to play better music because I can hear it in my office.
That's so funny because all I can hear in my office when a ship comes by is the propeller shaking the building. So that's amazing. I don't know which I prefer, propeller shaking the building or loud music. I think I prefer the propeller.
Well, we don't even have a boat going past our museum anymore. We're landlocked.
That's too bad.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess to talk a little about the Erie's relation to the St. Lawrence Seaway, since we're on the topic a bit. Yeah, so up until 59, I mean, we were a pretty viable route. And we still see some commercial shipping on the canals, largely for like really oversized goods. A brewery in Rochester, Genesee, they redid themselves in 2017, so they had to ship these massive beer tanks that couldn't fit down the highways or railroad tracks down it. They were pretty cool to see. Parts to it, I believe, nuclear submarine were shipped down last year, which, take that as you will. Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing one more question here in the chat, which is also kind of relates to what I said. But how many saltwater ships does the Seaway and Welland Canal see today?
I mean, the stats are available every year, so I encourage you, if you want the actual number, to go to the Seaway's website and look that up. But anecdotally, I mean, like half and half, maybe. Depends. It really depends on what's going on in the global economy every year, and the number of transits can dip if trade is down with China or the East. So it's like if we aren't making as much aluminum, then we're not going to see as much bauxite coming down. That kind of trade pendulum can impact the amount of transits that we have. So yeah.
Okay. See,
I did see one question about the commissariat.
Oh yeah.
So I can quickly discuss. So the building that the museum is located in is the oldest stone building in Ottawa, and we had a twin building on the east side of the canal that was the office of the Royal Engineers, and our building was literally the commissariat, so the storehouse for rations, black powder, and the like. So we have a vault with 3-foot thick walls to withstand cannon fire, and there's a series of doors and lintel mounted pulleys for loading barrels and crates into the building. So went from storing gunpowder to storing artifacts.
Nice. Yeah, I noticed a few Erie Canal specific or New York State Canal specific ones, but luckily Mike Riley has gratefully president of the American Canal Society, has answered many of them already, and had some interesting thoughts on Canadian canals. Let's see.
I did want to give a quick shout out to one of the Linda and Harold Clark people. I realized that there's more than there's many people in that group who were saying they're related to Frank Stearns, who was the designing engineer under both Weller and Grant, the chief engineers or the superintending engineers, depending on the title. And so Frank, the ski medal from the Engineering Institute of Canada for the lock gates on the Welland Ship Canal. So hello, descendants of Frank Stearns. That's super cool.
Yeah. Okay, so I have one more big question for all of us. I'll also quickly answer Don Orth's question about the role of the Oswego Canal in the New York State Canal System. Branches off of the Erie in 1828. What's really important is it goes past Syracuse's salt fields initially, and then it connects Lake Ontario to this larger system. And then once the Welland is complete, it's almost kind of a shortcut. You can hook up to a steamship on Lake Ontario, which will move your boat even quicker to the Welland, which is, like we mentioned, significantly shorter than the western half of the Erie Canal. So, question I'll end on though is, besides the escarpment for the Erie and Welland, what was the biggest geographic / topological challenge for each of our canals? And I assume they're also excluding Parliament Hill as well for you.
Yeah, that's your own little escarpment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go first? No, let's go in order of yeah.
Oh,
Is that
our starting order?
Yeah.
Okay. Often pointed to as one of the biggest challenges on the Erie are what are known as the Montezuma Marshes. They're north of the Finger Lakes. They're a low level of land. Which again, you got to figure out how to feed them, and they're these like malarial swamps that are just incredibly difficult to dig through, and yeah, a bunch of people got malaria. So
the most number of people died on the first and second canals excavating the deep cut. It is through a height of land that's higher than the brow of the escarpment, and then higher than Lake Erie. So with no water source above, as I was saying before, so they had to dig through. Originally, they wanted to tunnel. Tunnels collapsed, sort of like a barge canal tunnel, they were thinking. Tunnels collapsed and they couldn't do that. They were digging too low and the underwater springs were popping up. But really, it was the landslides of the soft soil in the deep cut between Allenburg and Port Robinson for our locals that killed the most amount of people. So that was definitely, and it was such a challenge that, as I mentioned, Oliver Phelps was brought in, or won the award really for figuring out how to excavate it safely. And he came up with this cool counterweight system of cart and ox that like sort of slowly went up the bank and slowly came down the bank at the same time, and to excavate it. And he won this big award. They advertised for a year almost about how to conquer this issue of the deep cut. So that's the biggest one for sure.
I think on the Rideau, it's kind of a combination of the two, because certainly Dow's Great Swamp, which now is today Dow's Lake, which is a great tourist location, certainly was a major challenge as regards like disease, and it was actually drained and redirected. Certainly digging and excavating for the Ottawa locks, there were a number of cave-ins and landslides. Again, Ottawa underwater springs was a big issue, so that created a lot of issues. And there's quite a few dams along the Rideau Canal, and for instance, like Hogsback and Jones Falls both had collapses during construction and were rebuilt several times. Taking the lessons learned. There's one instance where Colonel By was actually examining the dam at Hogsback when it began to collapse and narrowly missed being buried alive. So that's probably one of the bigger challenges, certainly. But yeah, very, very similar issues with, workplace safety, or rather the non-existent workplace safety, and unskilled labor versus the sheer amount of laborers required to do such work. So we commemorate the loss of those workers every year at events, and we have Celtic Cross at the locks, which we, have interpretation around and stuff like that too.
Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah. So that's all the questions we really have time for. We've gone a bit over, and I won't keep you guys here longer than. Yeah,
I don't think anyone's upset about it.
Yeah, I'm having fun here. But that said, thank you both for participating in this, and thank you everyone in the audience. You'll be getting a recording sometime tomorrow of this. Feel free to share it around, and keep an eye out for future canal conversations. And yeah, hopefully we can keep working together.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks so much for organizing us, Derrick.
Yeah,
Great job.
Derrick.
Yay.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, have a good night, everyone, and enjoy your summers.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.